"You're really letting Grandma's funeral get canceled," my cousin sobbed. "I paid my half and refused to cover hers until she shamed me in front of everyone. Then our uncle opened a folder and revealed what she'd been taking from. I'm Trent, 29M, IT network administrator in Phoenix. This whole mess started when my grandmother Betty passed away last week. She was 84 and had been battling dementia for the past 3 years. Grandma Betty basically raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 7, so losing her feels like losing a parent all over again. Here's where it gets complicated. My cousin Sable, 32F, was also raised by Grandma Betty because her mom was dealing with addiction issues and couldn't care for her. So we both grew up in that house, and Grandma treated us like her own kids. Sable's been unemployed for about 2 years now, doing odd jobs here and there but nothing steady. When it came time to plan the funeral, the costs came out to $8,500 total. I figured we'd split it 50-50 since we were both essentially her grandchildren and benefited equally from her love and care. I make decent money in IT, but $8,500 isn't pocket change for anyone. Still, I was ready to pay my half because that's what you do for family. That's when Sable dropped the bomb. "I can't pay half," she said when we met at the funeral home. "You know I don't have that kind of money. You have a good job, you can afford it." I explained that I understood money was tight, but we could set up a payment plan or find some other solution. Maybe she could pay $1,000 now and work out the rest over time. "Why should I have to go into debt when you can just cover it?" she said, getting defensive. "Grandma would want you to take care of this. She always said family helps family." That hit me wrong. Yeah, Grandma always preached about family helping family, but she also taught us about personal responsibility and pulling your own weight. The woman worked 2 jobs well into her 70s to make sure we both had what we needed. I told Sable I'd pay my $4,250 and she could figure out her portion however she wanted, but I wasn't covering the full amount just because I happened to have steady employment. "You're being selfish," she said, voice rising in the funeral director's office. "I've been taking care of Grandma while you were off living your life. I deserve consideration for that." This confused me because as far as I knew, Grandma had been in a memory care facility for the past year and a half. When I asked what she meant by taking care of, Sable got vague and said she'd been handling things and making sure Grandma was okay. I left that meeting feeling frustrated but stuck to my position. I transferred my $4,250 to the funeral home and told them Sable would handle her portion. If she couldn't come up with the money, we'd have to scale back the service or find another solution. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've gotten calls from several family members. My great-aunt Rita, 68F, thinks I should just pay the whole thing to keep the peace and honor Grandma's memory. My great-uncle Frank, 71M, says I'm right to expect Sable to contribute equally. My best friend Dylan, 30M, paramedic, thinks the whole family is nuts for expecting me to bankroll someone else's responsibilities. Yesterday, Sable called me crying. "The funeral home says they can't proceed without full payment," she sobbed. "Are you really going to let them cancel Grandma's funeral over money? What kind of grandson does that make you?" I pointed out that I'd already paid my half and the solution was for her to pay hers, not for me to pay everything. "I don't have it," she said, "and I can't get it by Friday. You're the only one who can save this." When I asked why she couldn't get even a portion together, she said she'd been struggling and hadn't been able to save anything. Then she dropped what felt like the real reason she expected me to pay. "Besides, you'll inherit most of Grandma's stuff anyway. You always were her favorite." That's when I realized this wasn't about funeral costs. This was about some perceived unfairness in how Grandma treated us, which honestly isn't even true. Grandma loved us both equally, but I stayed in school, got a degree, and built a career. Sable dropped out of high school and has bounced between jobs and unemployment for over a decade. I told her I wasn't paying her portion, period. If the funeral gets canceled, that's on her, not me. Now half the family is calling me heartless for letting money come between family, and the other half is saying Sable needs to take responsibility for her own obligations. Great-Aunt Rita actually ended up covering Sable's portion yesterday to save the funeral, but she's pissed at both of us now. The funeral is tomorrow, and I'm dreading it because I know there's going to be tension. Sable has been telling people I refuse to help bury our grandmother, which is complete bullshit since I paid exactly what I should have paid. So Reddit, AITA for not covering my unemployed cousin's funeral expenses just because I have a steady income. Update 1. Well, Reddit, the funeral was yesterday and holy shit, it was a disaster. Thank you all for the overwhelming support on my original post. Reading your comments helped me realize I wasn't crazy for expecting basic fairness from family. First, some context I couldn't include in my original post. When I got to the funeral home before the service, Great Aunt Rita pulled me aside and told me she'd covered Sable's portion not to help Sable, but to make sure Grandma got the send-off she deserved. That girl has been making excuses her whole life, Rita said quietly. But Betty raised you both better than this, and I won't let her funeral be ruined by petty nonsense. I thanked her and offered to reimburse her for Sable's portion, but she waved me off. Keep your money, honey. You did nothing wrong here. The service itself was beautiful. Grandma would have loved it. About 40 people showed up, family and friends from church and her old neighborhood. The pastor did a nice job talking about her strength and generosity. I gave a short eulogy about how she saved my life by taking me in and teaching me what unconditional love looked like. Then came the reception at the church fellowship hall, and that's where everything went sideways. About halfway through, while people were sharing memories and eating, Sable stood up with her coffee cup and asked for everyone's attention. I just want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my grandmother, she began, voice already shaky. Betty was the most generous, loving woman I've ever known. She always said family should take care of family, no matter what. I had a bad feeling about where this was going. Unfortunately, she continued, not everyone in the family learned that lesson. Some people think having money means you don't have obligations to help others. Some people think just because you have a job and others don't, you can pick and choose when to be generous. The room got quiet fast. People were looking around, trying to figure out what was happening. My cousin Trent makes good money, she said, gesturing toward me. But when it came time to bury the woman who raised us both, he decided his wallet was more important than family loyalty. If my Aunt Rita hadn't stepped in to cover what I couldn't afford, Grandma Betty would be sitting in a morgue right now because Trent refused to help. I felt every eye in that room turn to me. The temperature of friendly conversation dropped to Arctic levels. Some people looked shocked, others disappointed. My face was burning with embarrassment and anger. Dylan, who was sitting next to me, whispered, "Dude, you need to shut this down." I stood up slowly. The room was dead silent now. "That's not exactly accurate," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I paid my half of the funeral costs, $4,250. I expected Sable to pay her half, which seems fair since we both benefited equally from Grandma's love and care." "You have money," Sable shot back, tears starting. "I've been unemployed for 2 years. You could have easily afforded the whole thing. Having a job doesn't make me responsible for other adults' financial obligations," I replied. "If the situation were reversed and you had steady income while I was unemployed, I'd still expect to pay my own portion. That's what being an adult means." Great Uncle Frank, who'd been sitting in the back, suddenly spoke up. "Sable, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting your grandmother's memory." "I'm telling the truth," she said, voice getting higher. "He chose money over family. Grandma would be ashamed of him." That's when I'd had enough. "Don't you dare tell me what Grandma would think," I said, standing fully now. "I visited her twice a week until the day she died. I made sure her bills at the memory care facility were current. I brought her flowers and read to her even when she didn't remember who I was. So don't you dare question my love for her just because I wouldn't enable your financial irresponsibility." The room exploded into murmurs. Some people were nodding along with what I said, others looked uncomfortable with the whole confrontation. Sable started full on crying now, playing for maximum sympathy. "I took care of her too," she sobbed. "I did things for her that nobody knows about. I sacrificed for this family." Great Aunt Rita, who'd been quiet until now, stood up. "What exactly did you sacrifice, Sable?" she asked, voice sharp. "Because from what I saw, Trent was the one visiting, Trent was the one calling to check on care plans, and Trent was the one who made sure she had everything she needed." "You don't know everything," Sable said, but she was starting to look cornered. That's when Great Uncle Frank dropped the bomb that changed everything. "No, we don't know everything," he said, reaching into a manila folder he'd brought with him. "But we're about to." He pulled out a stack of papers and held them up. "These are bank statements from your grandmother's checking account for the past 2 years," he announced to the room. "I got them as part of settling her estate. Would anyone like to guess what they show?" The room went completely silent. Sable's face went white. "Regular withdrawals," Frank continued. "$34,000 over 18 months. Made with Betty's debit card while she was in memory care and couldn't possibly have authorized them." You could have heard a pin drop. "The bank flagged it as potential elder abuse," Frank said, looking directly at Sable. "They're required to investigate when they see patterns like this involving elderly customers with cognitive decline." Sable was shaking now, no longer crying, just staring at Frank in what looked like panic. "So when you talk about taking care of your grandmother," Frank continued, "let's be clear about what that meant. You took care of yourself, to the tune of about $2,000 a month, while Betty was eating one meal a day because the memory care facility said she kept refusing food." The room erupted. People were gasping, some were standing up, others were staring at Sable in horror. "Frank, stop," Rita said, but she looked more concerned about the scene than about protecting Sable. "No, I won't stop," Frank said firmly. "This family has been guilt-tripping the wrong person. Trent refused to pay for a funeral because he expected basic fairness. Meanwhile, the person demanding his generosity had been stealing from the woman we're here to honor." Sable tried to speak, but nothing came out. She grabbed her purse and practically ran from the fellowship hall. The aftermath was surreal. Half the room was comforting me, apologizing for doubting my position. The other half was asking Frank for more details about the bank statements. Dylan just sat there shaking his head and saying, "Holy shit, dude, holy shit." Frank approached me after most people had left. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," he said. "I was planning to discuss this privately with immediate family, but when she decided to publicly attack your character, I figured the truth needed to come out." I asked him how long he'd known. "Got the bank statements 3 days ago when I started the estate paperwork," he said. "I couldn't believe it at first, had to call the bank to confirm the details. They told me they'd been monitoring the account but couldn't intervene without family request because Betty never reported the withdrawals as unauthorized. Turns out, Sable had been using Grandma's debit card for everything. Rent, food, gas, probably other stuff too. The bank records showed withdrawals at grocery stores, gas stations, even some cash advances. She was basically living off your grandmother while the old woman was confused and vulnerable," Frank said, "and then had the nerve to demand you pay for the funeral of the person she'd been robbing." I drove home in a daze. Everything made sense now. Why Sable couldn't contribute to funeral costs despite claiming she'd been taking care of Grandma. Why she felt entitled to have me pay everything. Why she got so defensive when I asked what kind of care she'd been providing. She'd been stealing from a woman with dementia for over a year, and then tried to publicly shame me for not being generous enough to cover her obligations. Dylan called me that night. "That was the most insane thing I've ever witnessed," he said. "Your cousin is either completely delusional or the most manipulative person I've ever seen." I think it's probably both. Today I've been getting calls and texts from family members who were at the funeral. Most are apologizing for initially pressuring me to pay Sable's share. A few are asking what's going to happen next with the bank investigation. Honestly, I don't know. Frank is handling the estate legal stuff. I just know that I'm done feeling guilty for expecting basic fairness from family. Grandma Betty would be heartbroken to know what Sable was doing, but I think she'd be proud that I stood my ground on principle, even when it was hard. We'll update if there are more developments, but right now, I just want to grieve my grandmother in peace. Update to Reddit. It's been a week since the funeral disaster, and I have to update you all because this situation has spiraled in ways I never could have imagined. The support from my original posts has been incredible, and honestly, reading your comments helped me realize that standing firm wasn't just about funeral costs, it was about protecting my grandmother's memory and legacy. First, let me address what happened immediately after the funeral. Sable disappeared for 3 days. Nobody could reach her, her phone went straight to voicemail, and she wasn't at her apartment. Great Aunt Rita was actually worried something might have happened to her, despite being furious about the theft revelations. She finally surfaced Wednesday when great-uncle Frank got a call from her at 2 a.m. She was drunk crying, Frank told me the next day. Kept saying it wasn't her fault, that she was desperate, that Grandma would have wanted her to have the money anyway since she was taking care of things. Complete nonsense. Frank had spent the earlier part of the week coordinating with the bank's fraud department and gathering documentation for what was looking like a formal elder abuse complaint. The bank records painted an even worse picture than what he'd revealed at the funeral. The systematic theft started about 6 months after Grandma went into memory care. Small amounts at first, $200 here, $150 there. The bank's fraud specialist told Frank this is typical of family member financial abuse. They test the waters to see if anyone notices, she explained. When no red flags come up, they get bolder. By the end, Sable was withdrawing $801,000 monthly, plus random smaller amounts for what looked like everyday expenses. She'd essentially been living off Grandma's Social Security and pension, while Grandma's care was being paid from her savings account. The bank said if this had continued another 6 months, your grandmother's savings would have been completely depleted, Frank told me. She would have had to go on Medicaid or we'd have been scrambling to cover her care costs. That hit me like a punch to the gut. Grandma had worked her entire life to save enough money to care for herself with dignity in her final years. She specifically didn't want to be a burden on family, and she'd managed to save enough to pay for quality memory care without assistance. Sable was systematically stealing that independence from her. Wednesday evening, Frank, Rita, and I met with a detective from the Phoenix PD's Elder Abuse Unit. They take this stuff seriously in Arizona, apparently. The detective, Sarah Martinez, walked us through what a criminal case would look like. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Arizona when it exceeds $1,000, she explained. Based on these bank records, we're looking at potential charges of vulnerable adult abuse, theft, and fraud. The fact that the victim had documented dementia makes this a particularly serious case. She said the bank's fraud department had already flagged this for investigation, so there was a paper trail showing institutional concern about the withdrawal patterns. The challenge with family member abuse is proving intent to steal versus legitimate caregiving expenses, Detective Martinez said. But in this case, the victim was in full-time care, so there's no justification for these types of regular personal withdrawals. That's when she asked if we wanted to proceed with formal charges. Frank and Rita looked at me. Suddenly, this wasn't about estate management or family drama. This was about whether I wanted to see my cousin face criminal prosecution. I thought about Grandma Betty, about how hard she'd worked, how proud she was of her independence, how much she'd sacrificed to make sure Sable and I both had chances at good lives. I thought about her eating one meal a day at the memory care facility while Sable was using her money for rent and groceries. Yes, I said, we're pressing charges. Rita teared up a little, but she nodded. Betty would want accountability. She always said actions have consequences. Frank was more direct. That girl stole from a defenseless old woman. If it were anyone outside the family, we wouldn't hesitate. Family doesn't get a free pass to commit crimes. Friday afternoon, Sable was arrested at her apartment. Detective Martinez called to let us know it had happened quietly, without drama. Sable was booked on charges of vulnerable adult abuse and theft, both felonies. Her bail was set at $15,000. I found out she spent Friday night in jail because she couldn't make bail. Part of me felt bad about that, but mostly I felt like justice was finally happening. Saturday morning, my phone started ringing. Sable had apparently been calling family members from jail, trying to get someone to bail her out and claiming this was all a misunderstanding, and that I was destroying the family over money. Great Aunt Rita got the first call. I told her I wouldn't bail out a thief, Rita told me later. I said if she wanted help, she should have asked honestly instead of stealing. She started crying and saying she was desperate, but you know what? We're all desperate sometimes. That doesn't give you the right to steal from your grandmother. Sable's mom, who's been mostly out of the picture due to her own issues, somehow found out and called me Sunday. "How could you do this to family?" she screamed through the phone. Sable made some mistakes, but having her arrested, that's cruel. I explained that Sable hadn't made mistakes, she'd committed crimes against our grandmother for over a year. She was trying to survive, her mom said. You know she's been struggling. Then she should have asked for help, I replied, not stolen from a woman with dementia who couldn't protect herself. The conversation ended with her calling me heartless and hanging up. Dylan's been my rock through all this. He came over Sunday night with pizza and beer and we talked through everything. You know what's fucked up, he said. 6 months ago, if Sable had come to you and said she was struggling financially, you probably would have helped her out. He was right. If she'd been honest about her situation and asked for help, I would have at least tried to figure something out. Instead, she chose to steal from the most vulnerable person in our family and then tried to manipulate me into covering her financial obligations. She didn't just steal money, Dylan pointed out. She stole your grandmother's autonomy. That money was supposed to be Betty's safety net, and Sable turned it into her personal ATM. Monday, I got a call from Sable's public defender. He wanted to discuss the possibility of a plea agreement and asked if the family might consider dropping charges in exchange for restitution. I told him he'd need to talk to Frank since he's handling estate matters, but that personally, I didn't think money could undo what she'd done. She didn't just steal cash, I explained. She stole from someone who couldn't defend herself. She exploited my grandmother's confusion and vulnerability for over a year. That's not something you can fix by paying it back. Frank echoed the same sentiment when the lawyer contacted him. If she'd stolen $34,000 from a bank, would they drop charges if she paid it back? This is no different. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next month. Detective Martinez says cases like this often result in plea agreements, but that depends on Sable accepting responsibility and the family's willingness to support alternative sentencing. Right now, I honestly don't know what I want to happen. I'm not looking for revenge, but I am looking for accountability. Grandma Betty deserves justice, and other vulnerable elderly people deserve to know that this kind of abuse has real consequences. The weirdest part of all this is how much clarity it's given me about family dynamics. For years, I've been the one expected to be understanding, flexible, and generous, while Sable got sympathy for her struggles. Turns out, those struggles included systematically robbing our grandmother. I'm sleeping better now than I have since Grandma died. Not because I'm happy about the criminal charges, but because I finally feel like someone is standing up for her when she can't stand up for herself. Final update first, the legal resolution. Sable ended up taking a plea agreement in February. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of vulnerable adult financial abuse and received 3 years probation, 200 hours community service, and court-ordered restitution of $34,247 to Grandma's estate. She also had to attend financial literacy classes and undergo counseling for what the court called exploitation behaviors. Frank told me the prosecutor said this was a typical outcome for first-time family financial abuse cases, especially when the defendant accepts responsibility and agrees to make restitution. Honestly, I was fine with it. I never wanted Sable to go to prison. I just wanted accountability for what she did. The restitution is being paid in monthly installments of $400, which will take her about 7 years to complete. Frank set up the payments to go directly into an account that will eventually be distributed according to Grandma's will once probate is finished. Speaking of the will, that was another revelation. Grandma had left everything split equally between Sable and me, just like I'd always assumed. Her house, her savings, her personal belongings all split 50-50. The irony is that Sable would have inherited roughly $65,000 anyway once everything was settled. Instead, she stole $34,000 and now has to pay it back while also dealing with a criminal record. She cost herself money by being dishonest, Frank observed. If she'd just waited for the will to be processed, she'd be in a much better financial position right now. The hardest part of the legal process was actually the victim impact statement. The court asked family members to describe how the abuse affected our grandmother and us. Writing about watching Grandma refuse meals at the memory care facility while Sable was using her money for rent was probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to put into words. But it was also therapeutic. It helped me understand that standing firm on the funeral costs wasn't about money, it was about recognizing a pattern of entitlement and exploitation that needed to stop. The family dynamics have completely shifted since everything came to light. The relatives who initially pressured me to pay Sable's funeral costs have all apologized, most of them multiple times. Great Aunt Rita told me she felt guilty for months about initially taking Sable's side. "I kept thinking about how your grandmother would react if she knew what was happening," Rita said over coffee last month. "Betty would have been heartbroken about the stealing, but she would have been proud of you for standing up for what's right, even when it was hard." The extended family has rallied around me in ways I never expected. Cousins I barely knew started reaching out, sharing their own stories of watching Sable manipulate situations over the years. Apparently, her entitlement and victim playing were an open secret that everyone had just learned to work around. "We all saw it," my second cousin Mark told me at a family barbecue. "The way she always had excuses for why she couldn't contribute, but expected everyone else to cover her. We just didn't know how bad it had gotten." Great Uncle Frank has become more of a father figure to me through all this. He's been handling Grandma's estate with incredible care and has made sure I understand every step of the process. "Your grandmother raised you right," he told me recently. "She taught you that love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior. That's a lesson a lot of people never learn." The most unexpected change has been in my relationship with work and money. Going through this whole experience made me realize how much I'd internalized the idea that having a steady income made me responsible for other people's poor choices. I'd been quietly covering small expenses for Sable for years: dinner tabs, gas money, little things that seemed like no big deal, but added up over time. Now I understand that wasn't kindness, it was enabling. Every time I bailated her out of a small financial jam, I was reinforcing the idea that she didn't need to be responsible for her own decisions because someone would always rescue her. I've started putting that money toward causes that actually help vulnerable people. I'm now a monthly donor to our local elder advocacy organization and have volunteered with their financial abuse prevention program. It feels good to channel this experience into something that might protect other grandparents from what happened to mine. Dylan and I have grown closer through all this. Having a friend who witnessed the funeral confrontation and supported me through the legal process has been invaluable. He's also helped me process the weird guilt I felt about pressing charges against family. "You didn't press charges against family," he pointed out. "You pressed charges against someone who committed crimes against your family. There's a difference." I haven't spoken to Sable since the funeral confrontation. She's made a few attempts to reach out through other family members, usually around holidays or birthdays, but I'm not ready for that conversation and may never be. Her probation officer apparently encouraged her to write an apology letter as part of her counseling, but I told Frank I didn't want to receive it. Maybe that makes me unforgiving, but right now I need to focus on healing from watching my grandmother's dignity get stripped away during her most vulnerable time. Sable made choices every day for 18 months to continue stealing. She can live with the consequences. The house sale process has been interesting too. Grandma's home sold for $180,000, which after estate expenses and legal costs, leaves about $75,000 to be split between Sable and me once restitution is factored in. I've decided to use my portion as a down payment on my own house, something I'd been putting off for years. "Your grandmother always wanted you to have your own home," Rita told me when I shared my plans. "She talked about it all the time when you were younger. She'd be so proud." The weirdest part of this whole experience has been realizing how much mental energy I was spending managing other people's emotions and expectations. Without the constant worry about Sable's latest financial crisis or family drama, I've been more focused at work. Started dating someone wonderful named Jessica, who's a respiratory therapist at Phoenix General, and even picked up some hobbies I'd been putting off. Jessica has been amazing through the final stages of the legal process. She works with elderly patients regularly and has seen firsthand how financial abuse devastates families. "What you did took courage," she told me after the sentencing. "A lot of people would have just paid the funeral costs to avoid drama, and then the abuse would have continued indefinitely. You probably saved your grandmother's estate and protected other vulnerable family members from future exploitation." Looking back, I think the funeral confrontation was actually a gift, even though it was horrible at the time. If Sable hadn't tried to publicly shame me, Frank might not have revealed the bank statement so dramatically, and the abuse might have been handled quietly within the family without real consequences. Instead, the whole community witnessed the truth about what had been happening. There was no way to minimize it or sweep it under the rug after that. The most important thing I've learned is that protecting vulnerable people sometimes requires making unpopular decisions. When I refused to enable Sable's financial irresponsibility, I was actually protecting my grandmother's legacy and autonomy, even though I didn't fully understand that at the time. Grandma Betty always taught us that love means holding people accountable when they're making bad choices. She would have been devastated by Sable's theft, but she would have supported the decision to involve law enforcement. Betty believed in consequences, Frank said at our last family dinner. She believed that protecting people from the results of their actions was actually cruel because it prevented them from learning and growing.